Yesterday, those who praised his kindness now dragged him through the streets, calling him a thief. His response? No one saw it coming. The scent of freshly baked bread filled the small bakery as Elias pulled the last loaf from the oven. The golden crust crackled as he set it on the worn wooden counter, the warmth spreading through his calloused hands. It was the only loaf he had left, his last piece of work for the day and the only food he had for himself. Outside, the village bustled with life. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the stone cottages and dirt paths. Children ran barefoot, their laughter echoing through the streets. Merchants packed up their carts, their voices fading as they made their way home. Elias leaned against the counter, sighing softly. Business had been slow. He had barely sold enough to cover the cost of flour and firewood, and the few coins he had earned jingled weakly in the pocket of his apron. Yet he never complained. He had learned long ago that kindness held more value than wealth. For years, Elias had been the village's silent guardian, a man who gave without asking for anything in return. If a mother had no money, he slipped a loaf into her hands. If a weary traveller knocked on his door, he shared whatever little he had. Some repaid him when they could, others never did. But Elias never kept count. The villagers admired him, but admiration did not fill an empty stomach. He lived alone in the tiny shop, with only the warm glow of his oven to keep him company. As he sat down to rest, a sharp knock interrupted the quiet. Elias turned, wiping his hands on his apron. When he opened the door, a frail woman stood before him, shivering despite the mild evening air. Her clothes hung loose, her cheeks sunken. It was Miriam, a widow who had lost everything when illness claimed her husband and son. She hesitated before speaking. "I'm sorry, Elias. I wouldn't come if I had any other choice." Elias looked at her hands. Empty. No money. No trade to offer. She glanced at the loaf on the counter, her lips pressing together. Elias felt his stomach tighten. He had eaten nothing since morning. That loaf was supposed to be his supper. But he saw the way Miriam's fingers trembled, the way she swallowed hard as if fighting back shame. He didn't hesitate. "Take it," he said, lifting the loaf and placing it gently into her hands. Her eyes filled with tears. "Elias, I can't—" "You can," he said softly. "Go home. Eat." For a moment she just stood there, staring at him as if searching for the right words. Then with a trembling breath she whispered, "Bless you." She clutched the bread to her chest and turned away, disappearing into the night. Elias watched her go, a quiet warmth settling in his chest. It wasn't the first time he had gone to bed hungry, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But he could endure an empty stomach. He had done it before. He closed the door, sighing as he sat back down. His hands felt lighter, but his heart felt full. The bakery was quiet again, the fire in the oven dimming to embers. Elias leaned his head back, exhaustion creeping into his bones. Outside, the village carried on, unaware of the small act of kindness that had just taken place. And as Elias closed his eyes, he had no idea that by morning, the very same village would turn against him. The night was silent, broken only by the distant howl of the wind as Elias sat alone in his bakery. The warmth of the oven had faded, leaving the small shop wrapped in a quiet chill. His stomach twisted in hunger, but he ignored it. He had done the right thing. Across the village, in a dimly lit cottage, Miriam clutched the loaf of bread as if it were a treasure. She sat by the wooden table, her fingers tracing the warm crust, her heart heavy with emotion. She had knocked on that door with shame pressing down on her shoulders. She had expected Elias to turn her away, not because he was cruel, but because she knew he had little to spare. Yet, he had given without question, without hesitation. Tears welled in her eyes as she tore the loaf apart, sharing it with her two frail daughters, who ate hungrily, their little faces lighting up. "Mama, this is the best bread I've ever tasted," whispered the youngest, her voice filled with innocent joy. Miriam smiled, though her vision blurred with tears. "It's because it was given with kindness," she murmured. At that moment she silently prayed for Elias, hoping that one day she could repay him for his selflessness. Back at the bakery, Elias lay on his small cot, staring at the ceiling. His body ached from a long day's work, but sleep did not come easily. Hunger gnawed at his insides, but the thought of Miriam and her children sleeping with full stomachs eased the emptiness. A sudden loud knock shattered the silence. Elias sat up, heart pounding. The knocks came again, urgent this time. He hurried to the door, unlocking it to find 2 men standing before him. Guards, their torches casting long shadows against the walls. His brow furrowed. "Is something wrong?" The taller of the 2 men stepped forward, his expression stern. "You are to come with us now." Elias blinked. "What? Why?" But they didn't answer. One of them grabbed his arm. "You've been accused of theft." Elias froze. Theft? The word felt foreign in his ears. Before he could protest, rough hands pulled him forward, dragging him out into the night. The village, once peaceful, was now stirring. Faces peered from windows, whispers spreading like wildfire. Elias, the kind baker, a thief? The wind carried voices filled with doubt and suspicion. "Did you hear? He stole gold from Lord Hadrian's home. I always thought he was too generous. No man gives away food without a reason. Maybe that's how he's been surviving, stealing from the rich." Each word was like a knife, cutting deeper than Elias had expected. The same hands that had once greeted him with warmth were now ready to cast him aside. And for the first time in his life, Elias felt truly alone. Elias stumbled as the guards dragged him through the narrow village streets. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from sheer disbelief. The cool night air carried the distant murmurs of villagers who had been woken by the commotion. Windows creaked open, doors inched ajar. Eyes filled with curiosity and doubt peered at the scene unfolding before them. The man they had trusted, the baker who had fed their children when they were hungry, was now being dragged through the dirt like a common criminal. The guards said nothing as they led him to the village square, where torches flickered and shadows danced against the old stone walls. A crowd had already gathered, some rubbing sleep from their eyes, others wide awake, eager to hear the accusations, and standing at the front, his arms crossed over his richly embroidered robe, was Lord Hadrian. The nobleman's sharp gaze locked onto Elias as the guards pushed him to his knees. The silence in the square was suffocating. "This man is a thief." Lord Hadrian's voice rang through the night. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Elias swallowed hard. "My lord, Silence. Hadrian lifted a hand. "Gold was stolen from my estate last night. A witness has placed you near my home." Elias's brow furrowed. Near his home? He hadn't been anywhere close to the noble's estate. A figure stepped forward from the crowd. Matthias, a wealthy merchant who had never looked favorably upon Elias. Elias's stomach twisted. "Of course." Matthias smirked, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "I saw him, my lord, just last night, sneaking around near the estate. He had a sack in his hands, heavy with stolen goods, no doubt." A murmur spread through the villagers. Doubt began to seep into their faces. Elias clenched his fists. This was a lie, a cruel, calculated lie. "That's not true," Elias said, his voice steady but firm. "I was in my bakery all night. I never left." "Is that so?" Hadrian arched a brow. "Then tell me, baker, if you had been in your bakery all night, why were you seen giving away food you could not afford?" Elias froze. The last loaf. He had given it away without a second thought. But now, in the eyes of the nobleman and the watching villagers, it had become proof of his guilt. Hadrian stepped forward, looking down at him. "Only a man with stolen wealth can afford to be so generous." A hush fell over the crowd. Doubt was a poison, and it was spreading fast. A woman's voice broke through the silence. I don't believe it." It was Miriam. She stepped forward, gripping her shawl tightly around her frail shoulders. Her eyes burned with desperation. "Elias is no thief. He has always given, even when he had nothing." A few villagers nodded in agreement, but Matthias only sneered. "Or perhaps you are in on it too. Maybe he gave you a piece of what he stole." Miriam flinched as if she had been struck. Elias's jaw tightened. Enough! His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. The crowd fell silent again. He turned his gaze toward Hadrian. My lord, you have known me for years. Have I ever once given you reason to doubt my honesty? Hadrian hesitated. I have worked hard, day after day, just to earn enough to survive, Elias continued. And yet, you think I would throw it all away for gold? Hadrian narrowed his eyes. A desperate man does desperate things. Elias exhaled slowly. If I were truly desperate, why would I have given my last loaf of bread to Miriam? A ripple of uncertainty moved through the crowd, but before anyone could speak, Hadrian gestured to the guards. Enough of this. He will be held until we find the stolen gold. The guards grabbed Elias by the arms, pulling him to his feet. Miriam cried out, This is wrong. You're punishing an innocent man. Elias didn't struggle. He didn't plead. He only looked at the faces around him, the same faces that had once greeted him with warmth. And now? Now they looked at him as if they weren't sure who he was anymore. A lump formed in his throat, but he forced it down. Truth always reveals itself, one way or another. And so, with quiet dignity, he allowed himself to be led away. But as the guards dragged him toward the village prison, he could still hear the whispers, the doubts, the betrayal hanging thick in the air. And for the first time in his life, Elias wondered if kindness had been his greatest mistake. The cell was cold, the damp stone walls pressing in on Elias like a silent accusation. He sat on the hard floor, his back against the iron bars, his wrists aching from the tight ropes that bound them. A single torch flickered outside, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor. He had been locked away for hours, no food, no water, only silence and the weight of betrayal. Outside, the village was awake, talking about him, whispering, judging. Elias closed his eyes. He had always believed that kindness could never lead to harm. But tonight, as he sat behind these bars, he wasn't so sure. The heavy door creaked open. Footsteps echoed down the narrow hall. Then a familiar voice. Bring him out. It was Lord Hadrian. The guards yanked Elias to his feet and dragged him back to the village square. A crowd had gathered again, but this time their faces were different. Less anger, more doubt. Hadrian stood tall, his eyes sharp. Elias, the stolen gold has not been found, but the people demand to hear from you. The nobleman folded his arms. You still claim you are innocent? Elias held his gaze. Yes. A murmur rippled through the villagers. Hadrian smirked. Then answer me this. Why would a poor baker give away his last loaf when he had nothing to eat himself? Silence fell over the square. Elias exhaled, feeling every eye on him. This was his moment. He could beg. He could curse them for doubting him. He could scream about the injustice. But he did none of those things. Instead, he spoke calmly. Because hunger is temporary, but kindness lasts forever. The crowd hushed. I know what it is to be hungry, my lord, Elias continued, and I know what it is to have nothing but hope. Last night, Miriam and her children had nothing. So I did what I have always done. He turned, looking at the villagers. I gave, not because I had plenty, but because I knew what it meant to have nothing. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others looked down, guilt creeping into their faces. Hadrian narrowed his eyes. That is a touching story, Baker, but it does not clear your name. Elias didn't flinch. Then tell me, my lord, why would I steal gold and then give away my only food? Does that make sense to you? A few villagers nodded in agreement. Hadrian hesitated. But before he could speak, a young voice broke through the crowd. He's telling the truth. A boy stepped forward, a frail, dirt-covered child no older than 10. His clothes were tattered, his face smeared with dust, but his eyes burned with urgency. I saw what really happened. The crowd gasped. Hadrian turned to him. Who are you? The boy lifted his chin. My name is Sam. I work in your stables, my lord. Elias stared at him, heart pounding. Sam's small fists clenched. I saw who took the gold. It wasn't Elias. Silence. Hadrian's expression darkened. Then speak. Sam swallowed hard, his voice trembling. It was one of your own men. Another gasp. Hadrian's eyes flashed with anger. You dare accuse one of my gods? Sam nodded. I saw him last night. He took a pouch of gold from your chambers. When he left, he passed by Elias's bakery. That's when Matthias saw movement and assumed it was him. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Elias clenched his jaw. Matthias, the man who had testified against him. Hadrian's expression wavered. He wasn't expecting this. Before he could speak, a commotion erupted. One of the guards turned and bolted. The crowd shouted in alarm. Stop him! 2 men tackled the fleeing guard before he could escape. The pouch of stolen gold spilled onto the ground. Hadrian's face went pale. The real thief had been caught. Elias stood silent, his heart pounding. For hours he had been humiliated, locked away, called a thief by the very people he had fed and cared for. But now the truth stood before them. Hadrian turned to face Elias, his jaw clenched. For the first time he looked uncertain. The crowd, once filled with doubt, now looked at Elias with guilt and shame. Elias took a deep breath. He had been right to believe in kindness, and tonight, kindness had won. Elias walked through the village square, feeling the weight of the night slowly lift. The air was still thick with shame, but something had changed. The eyes that once looked at him with suspicion now held regret, and something deeper. Respect. A woman stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly. Elias, we failed you, she whispered. Others murmured in agreement. We doubted you so quickly. We should have known better. Elias looked around at the faces he had known for years, people he had fed, helped, and laughed with. He could have been bitter. He could have told them how much their betrayal had hurt, but he didn't. Instead, he smiled softly. You were afraid, he said, and fear makes people do things they regret. Tears welled in Miriam's eyes. How can you forgive us so easily? Elias sighed, his voice gentle. Because anger is a heavy burden, and I have no desire to carry it. The crowd fell silent. It wasn't just kindness that made Elias who he was. It was his strength, the kind of strength that didn't need to be loud or vengeful. Hadrian stepped forward, clearing his throat. I have given my word to ensure fairness in my judgments from now on. The villagers nodded. It was a small promise, but an important one. Elias looked at the nobleman, then at the people surrounding him. He had lost a night of peace, but he had gained something much greater. Trust, once broken, could be mended. Sam, the stable boy, tugged at his sleeve. Will you still bake for us? Elias laughed, the first real laugh in what felt like a lifetime. Of course. The tension broke, and relief washed over the villagers. A few even chuckled, shaking their heads at their own foolishness. Then one by one they stepped forward. A farmer placed a sack of flour at Elias's feet. To help you start again. A woman offered eggs. For the next batch of bread? A child held out a small bag of coins, no more than a few coppers. For the man who fed us, even when he had nothing. Elias's chest tightened. They weren't giving out of pity. They were giving because they wanted to make things right. He looked at them, the people who had once turned their backs on him, and saw something new in their eyes, not just regret, loyalty. He smiled. Then I suppose I better get back to baking. The crowd cheered, not out of excitement, but out of something much deeper. Elias had won something no gold could buy, and in the end, the man accused of being a thief had walked away with the greatest wealth of all, the love of his people. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more heart-touching tales.